Now, today's event is very special. We get to hear from two wonderful Canadian writers who have new, amazing books out this season. So I'm excited to introduce them. So, Zoe and Jordan, can you please join me on stage?
Hi,
Hello,
Ray.
thank you. Zoe Whittall is a poet, a novelist, and a TV writer who has won multiple awards. Her third novel, The Best Kind of People, was shortlisted for the Giller Prize. Her second novel, Holding Still for as Long as Possible, won a Lambda Literary Award for trans fiction. In 2018, she won a Canadian Screen Award for her writing on CBC's Baroness on Sketch Show. I imagine there's a lot of Baroness on Sketch Show fans here as well. So thank you for being with us. Jordan Tannahill, he made his name as a playwright and filmmaker in Toronto, winning the Governor General's Literary Award for drama twice. He now lives and works in the UK, where he wrote his autofiction debut novel, Liminal, which received wide acclaim as a portrait of millennials and won France's 2021 Prix de Jeunes Libraires. So Jordan, thanks for joining us as well.
Thank you so much.
So today, Zoe will be discussing her new novel, The Spectacular. Jordan will be telling us about his new novel, Listeners, which is also longlisted for the Scotiabank Giller Prize currently. Yay! So, Zoe, Jordan, wonderful to have you here. Take it away. Just so the audience knows, they're going to be interviewing each other and chatting about their novels between themselves. So, thanks for being here with us.
Thank you for having us, Ray. I'm really happy to be here, and I'm really psyched to talk to Jordan. How have you been doing?
I've been good, Zoe. Good to see you. And I was going to say congrats on the new house. I know from social media that you've just moved to the country.
I moved to the country. It's amazing.
It's so great. It looks nice from what I can see so far. You look pretty moved in already.
Yeah, that's an illusion. There's many, many boxes behind me. And you're still in Berlin, right? But not at the moment.
So I'm actually, in fact, at the moment, I'm actually on the traditional lands of the Algonquin people just outside of Ottawa. I came back to visit my mom, and I've just been back actually for just over a week. I'm living in London. I was just for a time living in Budapest actually for a couple of years and being a pain in Viktor Orban's ass as much as I could, along with other activists there around, a lot of activism around sort of gender and sexuality, politics. Orban, we're both very invested in this question. Orban was banning this gender studies from post-secondary education institutions when I was there, and so we were, doing a lot of protesting around that, and then he's just been kind of clamping down on all kinds of civil liberties all over the place. So that was kind of an interesting time, but I'm otherwise back in London now.
Okay. And you've been doing both theater and fiction. You've been juggling both for a number of years.
Yeah. I mean, it's I still feel like a little bit of an interloper in the world of fiction. But yeah. And in a way I find like with the listeners, like I really sort of felt my way into this book through dialogue and through character voice, which is still sort of my, the space where I feel most comfortable and most excited in my writing. And equally, of course, you've also been straddling these worlds as well. I mean, with television writing and novel writing as well. And I feel like I'm so keen to ask you about how those two are kind of mutually informing, if at all. And but just on the note of the move, actually, and speaking of and like locales and stuff, I feel like you're writing, for me, I feel like you are in a way a sort of like Toronto poet laureate in my mind. Like so many of your books are really steeped in Toronto culture and history and subculture specifically. And when I think about Missy and her like playing the cello in this indie rock band, I'm like, oh man, that feels like such a kind of millennial moment. Like when I say like millennial moment in not the generation as much as the year in Toronto, when that sort of the broken social scene moment and the hidden cameras and that I'm curious about how much of that scene or that moment is like fueled the like particularly Missy's character in the book or informed the writing around that band.
I did decide to make her a cello player, and even though it's 1997 when she's in the band and it's a little bit anachronistic, but also still possible because
Totally.
that, you know, they're a band from Montreal, and I feel like you know, I lived in Montreal in the 90s, and it was sort of like all of the creative scenes there at the time were interwoven. Like if you were in theater, you also played tambourine in a 17-piece band, and you also, you know, read poetry at cabaret nights and had a riot girl band on the side or whatever. And when I moved to Toronto, actually, it was a really big adjustment because I realized that the poets didn't know the playwrights, and the playwrights didn't know the queer playwrights, and like, you know, everything was so different. Because in Montreal, I think there were so few of everything that everybody just sort of hung out. But with Missy, I wanted her to sort of be in this moment that I remember very well from when I was in my late teens in Montreal, which was sort of this you know, explosion of do-it-yourself kind of riot girl era music. And she's sort of in an interesting position because she actually, you know, was part of the symphony world and was pursuing classical music at McGill, and decides to leave school in order to join this band, and the band sort of unexpectedly makes it really quickly. And we joined her when we first meet Missy. She's going across America with her band just as they're really hitting the big time. And for me, I had a lot of fun writing this sort of bacchanalian, crazy pleasure-seeking world that she is part of, and that she's trying to, you know, as one of the only women in a very male-dominated space, she's trying to, you know, have just as much fun as everyone else.
I love that line where you're like, you know, there's no one to ask a tampon for when you're, you know, when you're a woman in the rock world, you know, in this case, you know, or comparing her experience to being like in the army, you know, there's like a few women here and there, but mostly you're on your own. And that, yeah. Did you like that? Did you have a kind of firsthand experience of that world that kind of informed this work, or was that kind of just pure research that kind of allowed you to write that journey of Missy's?
It was like 90% pure research because, you know, I'd never been a musician of that level. Because I was 19 in 1995, I was a folk singer. You know, I was playing Ani DeFranco covers in Montreal at the bars. And so
I've seen photos of this. I think I saw something you posted, but like something about this time that you posted.
It was a fun time, and embarrassing in some ways. But they, you know, so and I come from a family of musicians. I've always been surrounded by musicians, and so I was interested in looking at the what if, what if you really made it when you were that young, and how would that impact you emotionally, and how would somebody who was really quite sheltered, she sort of has this interesting backstory in that she was raised on a commune with a lot of freedom, but also she was somewhat sheltered because it was rural, and she only knew who she knew. And so when she kind of lets loose on the world when in her early 20s, she sort of is both like a rebel, a kind of fearless rebel character, but also kind of sheltered in a unique way. But the idea of Missy, the idea for the spectacular came from a lot of different places, but one of them was like, what if it had never occurred to me that I was queer? Because I wasn't the kind of person who had these like really strong instincts at the age of 5. Like I was just sort of rolling with stuff. And then a girl kissed me when I was 18. I was like, oh, this is a possibility, and so there was a part of me that when I was writing Missy, I was like, what if I just kind of kept having lackadaisical affairs with cis men, and who would I have become, just sort of, and I took it from there, even though Missy as a character is really far from me. But I was really interested in asking you because I have always had this fantasy of being a playwright, and I've taken playwriting classes, and I love going to the theater. It's one of the things I miss the most with COVID. But it was really humbling when I took a playwriting class because I thought I knew all these things that I didn't actually know. And it's so different from TV writing. It's so different from writing prose. And so I wanted to ask you about the question I often get asked about TV and prose is the differences that you've since I've been in the TV world for about 5-6 years, I feel like I have a better handle on plot, and I have a little bit of a better handle on scene work, and certain elements of story I've become stronger at the more I work on screen. But at the same time, like the skills that you have to bring forward for both of them are really different. Like they kind of, the rules of good screenwriting are like the wrong rules for fiction in some way.
Yeah.
So I wanted to really ask you what like what makes a good playwright? What are the skills that you have to bring to theater that are different or similar that you have to bring to fiction? Does that make sense?
Totally.
It's a bit of a ramble.
Absolutely, yeah. No, absolutely. I think it's a great question, and I think it's, for me, playwriting. I think the real masters are writing for time and space. So they have a real sense of how this is playing out physically on a stage, and what the stage images are that they're crafting, and how it's using time, how it's playing out in real time in front of an audience. And usually when I'm writing for the stage, ideas come to me initially as stage images. So like, for instance, with my play Concord Floral, I think initially I just had these series of, it was almost like stage vistas or tableaus that I kind of linked together, began linking together with narrative. So I had this image of this like this huge plain of astroturf on stage with like haze and some sort of like floodlights, almost as if it was a baseball diamond at night, and there was just a lone girl walking across it, and I was like, what's her story, what's her journey? And then other kind of images emerged, with the idea of this like boy playing like these like drums in this field, or like people wearing animal masks or whatever, and then you eventually kind of dispense with certain images that don't fit, and you kind of move forward with the ones that do. But yeah, it's, for me, it's really a kind of it's kind of carving images in time and space. That's kind of how these things for me emerge, and then I begin to populate them with characters and stories. Whereas with fiction, I feel like there's I have other kind of entry points, I suppose. They might be more narrative, I suppose, or I think in the case of Claire, it was really her voice that presented itself, this character, and kind of wondering about how she deals with questions of faith, and kind of really charting my own relationship with those questions through her. So I feel like the playwriting that I feel like that often comes up short for me is playwriting that feels kind of televisual. That's the language that we are raised on. It's like, oh, this could be just a TV show, and it just feels a bit like people kind of talking at each other in this kind of sitcom-y kind of way, and as opposed to like, okay, how do we really use I keep coming back to it. How do we really use space and time? And something I'm kind of to follow up on that question in relation to Baroness von Sketch and the writing you've been doing generally. And I know you've been developing other shows and film projects as well. How does it feed back into your novel writing?
The funny thing is, often my novels are quite serious, and even though I'll have, like, there are some moments of humor in this book for sure, more so than in any other book. But it's really quite a different muscle. And in fact, I often feel like when I'm in comedy writing rooms that I'm a little bit outpaced by the serious professional comedy writers that I'm surrounded with. And so I often feel like, oh, my skill set that I bring to this is story and sort of zeitgeisty ideas and that kind of thing. And specifically on the Baroness von Sketch, in that writing room, I was sort of like, I feel so lucky that they let me come in and bring my perspective, but I didn't go to school for sketch. I'm not an actor, that kind of thing. So I was coming at it from a different angle. And but I do feel like, every day in a writing room, especially a comedy writing room, you have to be an idea machine, and you have to be an idea machine that can let things go. And I think novelists, famously, we like to be private and squirrel away, and we like to have our own ideas and hold on to them and stick with them and write 75 drafts of one thing. And in some ways, TV writing has helped me to be more collaborative as an artist and to let go of things that aren't working creatively, like or to like set them aside and go back. Because a thing when I used to teach writing is I used to tell my students to never share a draft of anything until until you have at least 10 drafts, until that final thing that you're showing somebody bears almost no resemblance to that first draft. Because, and I think that I used to say that because I'm a really impulsive writer. And I love that buzz you get when you think you have a great idea and you write those first few scenes and you're like, this is amazing. But you don't really have perspective at that point, or I don't anyway. And so I often have to hold off on showing those first drafts, but still trying to keep, retain that excitement that you have, which is the whole reason why we do this, right? Yeah, for me, TV is really the rules of TV are so different in that you have to, get into the scene at the last possible moment and leave at the first possible moment. And you don't have a lot of time for character first and a lot of rumination or a lot of complexity unless you're a showrunner, unless it's something that you have a lot of power in, because everything you write in TV, you're sort of writing for somebody in a suit who's either going to give you millions of dollars or not, and you're not the one in control of what goes to screen unless you've been in the business so long, or you have, you sort of get in at a certain angle and they let you run things, which is a thing I'm really excited to eventually do if that ever happens, but it's a real 1 in a million situation. And so that's the beauty of going back to fiction sometimes, is like, it is all me. It is, you do have more control and you can hold on to things and really work them through in a way that you're not on anybody else's timeline except your own. I at this point I can't even really remember your original question. I've just sort of
No, but I mean, actually, just riffing off that though, like in terms of processes of working, I remember reading somewhere that you began working on the spectacular before The Best Kind of People, and then actually put it aside, and The Best Kind of People just kind of took over, or just presented itself, and and I totally know how that feels. Like, okay, this is the loudest baby, or I need to pay attention to this. Can you speak about that? What happened there?
Sure. So yes, The Best Kind of People was a procrastination project because I didn't want to work on the spectacular anymore, and I think that was because I started with the character of Ruth, which is, for those who haven't read the book, Ruth is 83 years old. And I used some elements of my paternal grandmother's real life story of how she left Turkey, or had to escape Turkey in the 1920s as Smyrna was burning. She's a British immigrant who lived in Turkey. And so during World War I and in the War of 1922, there was, they had to evacuate. But I made Ruth very different from my actual grandmother. But I also I could never quite, when you're writing something and everything's going well, and then a character walks on the page and they're like a wooden robot, and they don't speak like a human. They have no blood in their veins. They're just like, I am a caricature of what this writer's trying to do. And, she never came alive, and I couldn't figure out why. And I tried all sorts of things to address it. I tried, reading nonfiction and memoir by women in their 80s. I tried to really, talk to older people, try to do it from a researchy kind of way. Still never could. And then I was listening to a podcast, and Ben Lerner was talking about how for his last book, The Topeka School, he couldn't, there was all this pressure within himself to, I'm paraphrasing badly, but to write the teenage boy character. And he just couldn't access his teen self now, all knowing what he knows as a man and as a dad. And he just couldn't go back into that, embodied space of being that teen boy. And I felt like, and so he sort of addressed it in the form. And I felt like, in order to crack the character of Ruth, I had to make different decisions based on the form. And so that's when I decided to write her section, to pull back, and instead of writing more, to write less, and to sort of give these vignettes, these sort of poetic fragments, which I think ended up making it more honest, because there's always an authorial voice that sort of haunts the work, right? And when you can tell when someone's not, there's a lack of honesty on the page. And I felt like the distance in the form of the literary fragment was the most honest, and then became the most naturalistic in that final draft. And that's what I'm hoping for anyway.
I agree. And I think that's also the part of the book where I felt like your poet self came out most clearly, perhaps, you know, in these kind of more lyrical fragments. And I guess sort of riffing on that, do you write poetry alongside when you're working on the spectacular? Does your prose mind take over, or do you still have this kind of other track where you're writing verse?
I do write poetry. I've been working on a new collection for about 10 years, and I just don't want to put it out until it's really good. So I still do write, and I actually find that I write, my fiction improves when I'm regularly reading poetry. Sort of like tilling the soil in my brain. But I want to ask you all about the hum, because I am someone who hears hum, like if there's like a weird unnerving sound anywhere, I pick it up, and it's just like, yeah, it's a thing. So when I started reading your book, it was like I was right with her. I could immediately understand. I felt like I really related, and I wondered if there was a moment where you that inspired that specific like audible element to the book that starts it all out.
Yeah. You know, initially I was reading about reports of people who did hear this hum, you know, this global phenomena that's been reported roughly since the early 70s. I love this mystery as to whether it was just a series of like localized white noise issues that people have just kind of grouped together as this kind of global phenomena, or whether it is indeed some kind of global phenomena that the scientists, you know, a number of scientists have kind of put forward these really often kind of sublime theories to answer, you know, to account for it, including this one by this team of French scientists, which suggests that perhaps ocean waves rolling against the ocean floor and concussing against the continental shelf is creating these vibrations, or you know, the jet stream is shearing across, you know, is shearing against low and high pressure systems, and this is what's causing this kind of atmospheric resonance. So it's very kind of beautiful explanations, or possibly, you know, these more kind of human built issues like the electric grid is causing some kind of hum, or the you know, submarine sonar or whatever it is. And I find I guess what I was interested in was the enduring mystery of it, for sure, and the ways in which it kind of touched on elements of even conspiracy culture. I mean, the ways in which it's only kind of a half step and a jump between you know, oh, it's electromagnetic waves from cell phone towers, to this is a government mind control experiment, or this is, you know, a 5G, you know, just getting into 5G conspiracy, really get into the depths of it. So I'm interested in that. I'm interested in the ways in which it kind of touches on the sort of malleability of truth, the subjectivity of truth, and the ways in which that plays out even on a micro level within a family, how sometimes one person only can hear this hum within a family or within a household, and the ways in which that isolates them, the ways in which a family might dismiss these symptoms as being psychosomatic, or you know, as being hysterical, even, you know, casting someone as the hysterical subject. Yeah, there was something about it that really that element really intrigued me. And I think, you know, in the book, Claire is someone who really suffers a kind of existential agony around not knowing the source of her suffering. You know, she really needs to sort of understand what the source of this hum is, as a way of possibly somehow maybe she thinks by knowing what it is, she'll be able to kind of hold it and control it, or minimize its effects on her life. And it got me thinking about the ways in which, you know, we seek to know the cause of our suffering. And I think on a more sort of, I suppose, philosophical level, you know, is it better to invent a source for our suffering? And by this I mean perhaps even faith itself, you know, to tell ourselves stories that explain why we suffer, you know, why do we die, or even why do we live, why do I get sick and that person doesn't, and versus simply admitting that we may not know and sitting in that space of not knowing. And for me, I think that was kind of maybe one of the central things that I was sort of trying to investigate with the hum, the sound, and the sort of mystery around it. Is it better to imagine a source or an answer, or simply to sit in that state of not knowing?
Right. That's so interesting, especially since there's so much emphasis now in the zeitgeist around anxiety and trauma, and around just accepting accepting what we don't know, accepting uncertainty, all the kind of Buddhist. It's interesting. I was really impressed by how you used time in the book, and how, like, I was really, it's quite a classic page turner in some ways, but like not so in other ways, like because it's so character driven. And I was wondering how you decided on the ending. I don't know if you want to spoil how much you want to say, but there were a couple times where I thought I knew where you were going, and you were going in a different place, and I loved that. And I wondered, just because right now I'm trying to work on a new book where I'm trying to structure in some mystery and some suspense and some unexpected plot points, and I wondered, like, how did you approach that in this book?
Yeah. Well, I both with Liminal and the listeners, I think I had to kind of fool myself into writing a novel. Like in both cases, I was like, I'm not writing a novel. And I think I would have psyched myself out if I had set out with that intention. Like with Liminal, I kind of set out writing a kind of series of auto theory essays, kind of like Nelson-esque, aspiring to be Nelson-esque, auto fiction essays, auto theory essays rather, and then like fiction or narrative emerged, I guess. First, narrative emerged in a non-fictive capacity first, and then I thought, oh, well, what if I can just add a bit of fiction here and there to kind of link things thematically, and then fiction began to be a kind of suture to these pieces of these kind of more essaic pieces, or kind of more like critical theory pieces, and so what ended up in time becoming a novel, I sort of backed my way into it without looking at it. I was like, I'm not writing a novel. But I think the case with, and similarly with the listeners, to kind of answer your question about how to structure it, I mean, I wrote it initially as a play, it was initially a commission that I wrote with the National Theatre in London. They were very kind to give me a workshop, and I had the incredible privilege of hearing the piece come to life, and really hearing these character voices, understanding their lines of argument, and being able to try and create these sort of three-dimensional individuals with their own backstories and their own syntax and everything. But it was like a 4.5-hour play. It was like a totally unwieldy, unstageable play, and I just had to I would have had to cut it down in half. Basically, I would have had to pretty much decapitate it in order to fit it in one evening. And I thought, that would just kind of create this kind of pat cult narrative, or this pat sort of downward spiral narrative. And, I wasn't so interested in that. And so I thought, what we really, actually not dissimilar actually from Emery MacDonald's experience with Fall on Your Knees, which was, I think, also written initially as a big unwieldy play that she then reimagined as a novel. But the novel provides so eloquently, or elegantly rather, and so much more effectively than other mediums, is the ability to chart a character's inner psychology. You can really just enter Claire's mind and really sort of be lockstep with her as she makes these series of decisions. And oh, hello. And
really,
so in terms of,
hi, this is
who's that? What's her name or his name?
His name is Coach, and this is where he likes to sit during yeah.
Best seat in the house. Seems a little sweetie. But yeah, so just to answer your question, I think that even though I kind of broke down the play and started from scratch pretty much, and just kind of began writing the novel, from more or less from scratch, I did pull a lot from the play here and there, and I used its overall structure to kind of structure the piece. And so yeah, I guess
that doesn't surprise me. When you say that, it doesn't surprise me. Like, yeah, interesting.
Because there are these kind of scenes in a way, like I was thinking, reminded a little bit of I'm actually reading Crime and Punishment right now, and I'm so struck by how much dialogue there is in this book, and there really are, like, there are these kind of showpiece scenes where people are just talking at each other, and people are entering and exiting, and there's, and it's obviously it's masterful. I mean, but it's there is a kind of scene building or scene, like it's a, there's a theatricality, I guess, to it, which I think is interesting and resembles, I mean, I guess the listeners resembles it in some way, these series of dialogue scenes. But yeah, but I tell you, so when you're writing this new book, that's, I'm amazed, like I'm struggling to separate, like when talking about this, the spectacular, how you're able to sort of begin working on something new. I'm still sort of like, I feel like I'm still processing the listeners and just talking about it so much. I'm like, I have no sort of headspace for something new. But how like this new idea, how long has it been percolating for, and how do new ideas present themselves to you?
Good question. I have a little bit of a superstition in that when I'm right before a new book comes out, I like to know what I'm doing next. Like I like to have at least started something next. Otherwise, I can just watch TV for 2 years and then I'm panicked. So this next book I'm trying to write is, well, I have a book of short stories coming out in the interim, but the next book is it's called The Fake for now, and it's actually kind of a fictionalized retelling through two very different characters than myself of the emotional experience I had with an ex-girlfriend who was a pathological liar.
Oh, wow.
And she lied to me about having cancer, and it was an intense, like, it was a bananas.
It's like such a common, it's like people, like real pathological liars often lie about terminal illness, whether their own or family members. Or
the funny thing is that I don't know if I actually read this as a statistic or if I was just sort of observing it casually in researching con artists, but a lot of men pretend to be doctors and surgeons, and a lot of women pretend to be sick, which I guess is like, feels like a kind of banal statement on gender and the world, but that was the true case with my ex partner. And so I decided I've always sort of wanted to write about it, but it was too close. And now, it's been 15 years and it's something that it's an experience that sort of gave me a weird gift, in that if I walk into a room and somebody walks in who has that same kind of pathology, I will know instantly. It's like a light comes down and shines on them. And the funny thing is that they're usually incredibly charming. Like just everybody in the room is kind of drawn to them, and they have these very particular kind of skills to make people like them. And now it's just like I know instantly, and I know instantly to stay away. And so can
you give me an example of one like hallmark tell?
Yes. So if somebody, and this is going to be oversimplified, but in some ways, if somebody that I just met discloses something incredibly personal in the first 5 minutes of meeting them, then that's a red flag tell for me. And also if somebody tells a story that's like incredibly dramatic, but where they're the hero in right away, like the kind of uncomplicated hero moment, or there's a bunch of them, but those are the two, and the extreme charm, so I'm trying to write about that experience, but I sort of made, I have two narrators. One is a kind of middle-aged guy who just gets divorced, who picks her up at a bar, and then there's a woman that she meets in a grief support group who just lost her wife. And so it's a kind of about this whirlwind connection that they have with this person who totally fucks with their life. And it's fun so far, but it's like structurally there's several interesting problems in that there's so much mystery and suspense in the story, but the reader from page 1 is going to know that they're a con artist. Like, it's a con artist story. And so how do you keep people guessing and wanting to keep going when they already know the deal? It's a kind of creative problem.
Love it. I feel like we'd be remiss, and we're both well used to being asked this question, but I feel like I'd be remiss to say, acknowledge we're both queer authors. And I'm just curious about to what extent, again, a banal question perhaps, but I feel
have it on my list of questions for you.
Queer question mark exclamation mark. But yeah, I just curious about like I mean, your queerness, I think, like my own, I mean, suffuses your writing in a, obviously in a really beautiful lived way, spectacular included. And just to what extent is that conscious or unconscious? And yeah, maybe I'll start there.
Okay, that's a good question. I feel like even when I write about straight people and straight worlds, there's a bit of a queer lens that can never really shift.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if that's a weakness or a strength, but I think inevitably it's just kind of there on the page. But I'm also aware that, you know, I've been publishing since 2001. And when I wrote The Best Kind of People, I did it very consciously. Like it's like I made a creative decision first, but then it kind of became a bit of a business decision in some way, where I was like, I'm going to see if I can write a social novel, a family novel, like in that kind of classic sense form wise.
Mm-hmm.
And I also am going to see if I can write something that will sell at the airport, like a literary fiction offering, but also one that maybe would allow me to own a house.
Yeah.
So it's like a bit of a like, I don't know, I just really struggled to make a living for many years. And so that those were the kind of conscious, it sounds kind of cynical, but I feel like the reality of queer writers who write contemporary queer work is, you know, the late Richard Vaughan told me when I was 30, I was on a panel with him and I was the voice of the young, so crazy to think now, but I was the voice of the young writer and he was, I think, the voice of the middle-aged or something. I don't know, there was some sort of, we weren't that far apart in age, and yet he was, you know, he was more established. And he talked really eloquently about there being a pink ceiling and about how everybody he came up with in the early aughts writing fiction, you know, the straight people were able to make it above a certain echelon and the queers weren't. And I think that up until very recently, that was very true. So the fact that like my work is on the Giller list, your work's on the Giller list, you know, Brandon Tyler and Garth Greenwell are in the New York Times, like this is all very new and it's amazing. And I'm really happy and grateful for it. But it's also like, I'm aware that the feelings of, you know, outsiderness and marginalization just kind of never leave you when you think about your career, if you're a certain age and you've been doing it a certain amount of time. So I think that no matter what I write, like even if I'm writing about aliens, I feel like I'm always sort of thematically writing about anxiety because that's my main thing. And I'm also always sort of looking at things from a queer perspective because I think anyone who came out when I did and earlier, you're kind of saddled with that, and it's a blessing and a curse in some ways creatively. How about you?
Yeah, I mean, totally eloquent answer. I believe I secret in queerness, and not so secret. I mean, there are sort of explicit references to it in the book, but I feel like I secret in a major queer sort of presence in the book in the form of the hum. I mean, I think the hum itself, I feel like almost a kind of embodied queer death drive in the story, in that it sort of it's like Claire, it's this force that kind of enters Claire's life, but also that which she invites into her life to a degree as well, that kind of disrupts the normative and status quo, and it's connected to this kind of libidinal drive for her. It's this kind of ecstatic drive, and it kind of reorients her in a kind of a queer way, I think. And so there's this, and I think her experience, her journey with the hum really mirrors my own in relationship to a number of things in my life: trauma, sexuality, the ecstatic, spirituality, all kinds of things, and which for me are all inherently queer through my own experience of them. So yeah, actually I talk about some of this, you know, it mentioned R.M. Vaughan, and for those who are watching who may not know R.M. Vaughan, you know, a really obviously iconic, you know, sort of national treasure of a performance artist, a poet, a writer, all around kind of public wit critic, a dear friend of both of ours. Yeah, you know, and a real misanthrope as well, and a real, you know, a real personal hero. And we lost RM during the pandemic, in 2020, and it left a big hole in a lot of our hearts. I was actually speaking about RM and missing Richard. I had this interview for Fugue with Richard with Bugs Bennett, and was asking me about I was talking about all kinds of stuff like doing sex work and sexual assault, trigger warning of those interview, and also missing Richard. And that was such a, it was so beautiful that he brought that up, actually. And thinking about our queer peers and sort of older siblings, those who kind of paved the road for us, who kind of broke that ground. And Richard, I think, is very much someone like that, who was making space for someone like me now to kind of do what I'm doing. I'm wondering if you have people like that in your life, maybe Richard as well, but other artists, either nationally here or elsewhere, who you feel like kind of broke ground for you.
Yes, well, okay, when I was in my early 20s, probably this is when I met Richard, and I met a lot of people. When I first moved to Toronto, I worked as a receptionist for Extra magazine, and at the time, everybody who was a receptionist was also doing customer service for the gay sex line cruise line, which was super fun and weird, and it was like a 24-hour job. So sometimes you were working at 3 a.m, and everybody was queer, everybody was in their 20s. It was a really great job. Great and terrible in some ways, but so the writers who wrote for Extra would come in, because it was sort of like just the early internet. They would come in and they would get their mail in their file folders. And so at the time I was obsessed with Greg Kearney, who was a great humor columnist, and he was an amazing novelist. He's one of these writers, one of these in particular gay writers, who I think if they lived in New York, they'd be famous, and I think because Canada is so boring and homophobic up until 5 minutes ago, he doesn't have his due yet, but I really hope that he does. Yeah. And but anyway, but someone who was really influential for me was Marnie Woodrow, who used to also write a humor columnist for Extra, and she was the first novelist I ever met, really one of the first I ever met. And so when I was a receptionist, I would make her these, like, it was so cheesy, early 20s lesbian activity, but I would write her like poems and zines and like leave them in her mailbox. And we're still friends years later. Like, she just came to visit me out here in the country like last week. And so, but she was really one of the first people that I could like look in the eye and say, like, you write novels? That seems crazy. It seems like improbable that you're a human being in my presence who would do something so lofty. But she was very inspirational and really like grounded, and gave very good advice about it.
Yeah.
And I think back in those days, like, queer people, like, the only reason I got a grant for my first novel was because there was a lesbian on the jury. The only reason I got my first book contract was because there was a gay editor at a press, and all the other presses said no, and he was like, I see something in this. Same with my second editor. Like, there are always like this underground network that I think now can be above board.
Yeah, that's really, really beautiful and true. And I think with the pandemic lately, I've been really thinking a lot about kind of queer kinship networks and the ways in which we sort of support one another and to survive, to get through periods of hardship and crisis. And I know, again, from social media, that you had to isolate alone, which I'm sure was very hard, but how and I actually can't imagine, but how just maybe speaking of, because we kind of just have come through this totally harrowing period, what sustained you, and what relation, I mean, were there kinship networks that did kind of help sustain you even remotely, or how did you sort of navigate that period?
It was hard. I mean, it's still kind of hard, although it's much less hard in the smaller town. I feel like COVID sort of everything about Toronto and why you want to live there sort of went away with COVID, and a lot of my friends have left the city this year. And I have a great community there, and I never felt alone, but I was alone for most of it. I was very cautious about COVID, so it was unusual, and it was just unusual timing in that I've been in relationships from all of my adult life up until fall of 2019, and I decided to stay single on purpose. for the first time, and to also be writing this book about family while doing so was like, it was pretty intense to try to be, have this kind of emotional and intellectual project that overlapped during this really crazy time. So yeah, I mean, I think, we both know how queer people really do know how to come together in a crisis better than well, I don't know, I can't speak to other communities because it's my only community, but I do feel like there is already sort of a system of interlocking networks to hold each other because our familial networks haven't always been as strong.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
How about you? How has the pandemic affected your life?
I mean, it's so much of my work in my life was about live performance and events, and so that yeah, that sort of put up a huge pause on all of that, and I think in a way laid the made space for me to finish the listeners, and in a way I kind of credit, I guess, the pandemic with giving me the time and sort of headspace to do that. But yeah, it's strange that when your medium is sort of in a coma, in some ways, and you're like, I was writing this new play called Prince Faggot, and it's sort of I'm like really excited about it. It's kind of like this sort of kind of political satire about the royal family, and I'm like, oh, this is going to be, I can't wait for this to happen in 10 years from now, like 5 years from now, whenever there's new space and in theaters to do shows again. It's very strange to kind of, it's hard to be inspired when you're not seeing work. Which is such a feedback loop. You see work and you want to run home and write your own stuff and be inspired by images and lines and moments. So it's hard to be inspired. It's also hard to write when you know there's nowhere really for it to go, at least not for a while. So it's things are waking back up, and I feel that impulse returning to me again to write for the stage and see things on stage again, which is extraordinary. I just saw an incredible play by Alicia Harris in at the Royal Court Theatre in London called Is God Is. It's really challenging, beautiful piece. Definitely a playwright to watch, and so like, okay, I'm inspired again. I want to make plays again, but it was hard for a couple of years to imagine doing that.
Do you have a sense of how theater in general, or how your work for the stage is going to change because of COVID? Or
it's interesting. I feel like I was really attracted to a kind of almost a sort of modernist sort of Artaud impulse about kind of assaulting an audience, or sort of like assailing us, assailing them in some way, or kind of shaking an audience awake, or even if I didn't resort to the theater of cruelty as such to do so. But I think there's still a role for that, of course, but I also feel like there is also a space for care, and also for these people have, we've all come through the shit together, and these people are really choosing to be back in a theater, which is a real choice, and so is that the right tact maybe to take with them? Maybe it might be, but there might be other tacts to take as well. And I think that's something I've been thinking about a little bit, is how do we welcome an audience back into the theater, and in a way remember the sacred space that is a theater, and it is congregating with others, and that's a very for me, it's a very kind of sacred right. And so not true with people with kid gloves, but definitely kind of account for what we've been through a little bit.
Interesting. So I'm seeing in the time now, we're at 5 to I don't know what it is in Pacific, 5 to 4 out here. Where does anybody have any questions in the audience?
Let's open questions up.
I don't know that I'm looking at the right place, but let's see.
Jorge, do you know?
Hi.
Oh, yeah. Hey.
Hi.
I was just mesmerized by hearing everything you were saying as a reader of your work, but also as a lover of the theater and the arts. What you were saying about the sacredness of those spaces was really made me think a lot. So if the audience, if anyone has any questions that they want to add, we have Zoe and Jordan for 5 more minutes. If you don't, that's totally fine. If you're just absorbing like me, that'd be wonderful. But
Thank you so much for tuning in as well during your lunch hour. That's really, or I
Yeah.
mean, for those of us who are in BC, it's your lunch hour, but you might be tuning in from elsewhere as well. So thank you so much for
Yeah,
spending
and
the
just
hour.
so you all know, who those of you who are watching, we'll have this on our Facebook page live, so that if you want to share it with other friends who weren't able to attend because of the time, or because Vancouverites love their sunny days, and it turned out to be a sunny lunchtime, so people probably rushed outside to
Inside.
to catch a bit of a walk before the rains come back. But I don't see any more questions. I wanted to ask you too. What is the tour looking like for you? And this is a very weird moment to be releasing two books, but also I imagine you're getting a lot of moments of intimacy with audiences because you're appearing in their living rooms like today. How has that felt? Has it been very different, or do you like it? Do you not like it? What's it like?
There are things I like about it in that we were just speaking about this, but like I'm working on a new project, so it's rare that I can actually be writing while also promoting a book.
Yeah.
So that's great. And it's certainly less stressful in terms of travel, but I really miss meeting other writers. It feels like you have every time you put out a book, it kind of feels like there's a cohort and you see them in the airport and you see them at festivals, and that's really a fun part of it for me socially. So I do miss that, and I also miss sort of just talking to people at the signing table and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. I definitely miss actually meeting audiences as well. I mean, or readers rather. That's like such a yeah, that's a really nourishing experience. But I mean, I love the fact that there's a very low, carbon footprint. It's great. I mean, it's feels almost untenable now to be sort of city hopping across Canada on a plane, just to do a reading or two. It just feels like, is that even something we're going to do from now on? I mean, probably to some extent, but it's like, I'm not sure I really want to, so it's I feel like this change has come at has say a good time. I feel like it's come probably too late in terms of the averting climate catastrophe, but it's like I actually don't think we're going to probably end up going back maybe to a kind of heyday of sort of festival touring, festival events, and I think that's maybe not such a bad thing to some extent.
Yeah, we're seeing the same, I think, from a programming perspective. The idea that we can invite authors who might not be able to fly from London or from somewhere else for one event, an hour event at a library in Vancouver. That gives us the ability to showcase different work to audiences that also might not necessarily want to come to downtown. So people who live in the suburbs of Vancouver or have things to do afterwards, taking care of kids or home, can't come. So it's allowed us to expand and to reach more audiences. So anyway, enough from me. People were here to listen to you. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Really
Thank you
had a
for
lot of
having
fun.
me.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that, Zoe. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Really nice
Thanks,
to
Jordan. It was awesome to talk to you.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that.
And thanks everyone for spending your lunchtime with us. Candy's going to put back the presentation so that you can see what events are coming back. But events are we have coming up. As I was saying, if you want to watch the event again and share it with friends, it's going to live on our Facebook page. So Candy's going to share the link to that page right now. Also, we are a public institution, so what we program is for you. So we want to hear from you about how this went. So please give us your feedback. We're going to put a link to a quick feedback form. It should take about 2 minutes to fill out. I promise you, your replies don't go into a black hole of the internet. We read all of them, and we adapt our programming based on what the audience tells us. So if you feel like you enjoyed yourself today, I want to tell you about two upcoming events that we have. So tomorrow we're hosting Inuk writer Norma Dunning. And Norma's going to be discussing her new story collection. It's about the experiences of modern-day Inuk people in southern Canada. And she's going to be talking with Patsy Folger, who is an associate editor for the Inuit Art Foundation. Very exciting, tomorrow at 7 p.m. Vancouver time. And then next Wednesday, we're hosting Montreal writer Kim Thuy, who also is longlisted for the Giller. And she's going to be discussing her new novel, M, which it's inspired by the historical events of during the Vietnam War, and it tells the story of Vietnamese expatriates all over the world, and it's really about the heroism of their daily acts of survival. So that's going to be great next Wednesday, and that's it for today. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Jordan. Thank you, Zoe.
Right.
We're going to keep the event open for 5 more minutes just so that the audience can click on links, and if they want to connect with each other, that's fine. But for now, Zoe, Jordan, and myself are going to leave the stage. So thank you everyone for coming. Have a great day.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye, guys. Thank you.